Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The glass walls of Michael Okafor's 33rd floor office reflected the sprawling Lego skyline, glittering towers, sprawling estates, and the ceaseless hum of commerce below. It was the kind of view that made lesser men feel invincible. But Michael was restless. His tailored gray suit fit him like armor, every crease sharp, his gold cufflinks catching the afternoon light. Across the sleek conference table sat Philip Iwobi, his political strategist, a man with the easy arrogance of someone who could turn whispers into headlines and headlines into victories. Philip didn't bother with small talk. He tapped a stack of polling data with a manicured finger. Your numbers are stagnant, Michael. The business elite respect you, but the masses, they see you as cold, untouchable, a man who sits in a glass tower and doesn't understand the street. Michael leaned back, expression unreadable, swirling the last of his black coffee in its porcelain cup. He had heard this before a dozen times in different ways, but Philip's tone made it sound urgent. You want the governor's seat? You need a story. Not numbers, not endorsements. A story the public can hold on to. Philip slid a glossy folder across the table. Inside were photographs, a juvenile correctional facility in Surulere, rust-stained gates, overgrown grass, young boys in faded uniforms sitting in courtyards. Rehabilitation, Philip said, his voice low, as if unveiling a secret weapon. We sponsor a program there. Literacy classes, vocational skills, mentoring. You become the man who gives second chances. Cameras will eat it up. Every speech, every handshake, a reminder that you care about the next generation. It'll erase this cold billionaire label. Michael's jaw tightened slightly. Not because of the suggestion itself, he had sat through countless PR pitches, but because he could already see the headlines Philip was selling. Okafor champions youth reform. It would work. People would cry over televised hugs and scripted success stories. And the votes would follow. Fine, Michael said finally, closing the folder with deliberate calm. Set it up. Get the press involved. I want this to be seen. Philip smiled, sensing victory. He didn't need Michael to care, just to agree. But as Michael turned his chair toward the skyline, his eyes drifted beyond the high-rises to the distant, crowded neighborhoods where the roads were cracked, and the air was thick with the scent of frying acra and exhaust fumes. He told himself it didn't matter. This was politics, not charity. He didn't have the time or the interest to become anyone's savior. This was a play for power, a move on the chessboard. Still, somewhere in the quiet part of his mind he rarely visited, the thought crept in. I've never set foot in a place like that in over 30 years. And without realizing it, his fingers tightened slightly around the armrest of his chair. The day of the visit arrived with the usual choreography of Michael's public appearances, the convoy of black SUVs, the earpiece-wearing security detail, the flutter of TV station vans following in the rear. By the time they reached the Surulere Juvenile Center, the front gates were already lined with staff in their best clothes, eager for a handshake that might come with a donation. The building itself was tired and weathered, its paint peeling in sun-bleached strips. The air smelled faintly of damp cement and disinfectant. Michael stepped out of the car to the familiar staccato of camera shutters, his navy suit immaculate, his tie the exact shade of power red that Philip insisted tested best with middle-class voters. He smiled for the first row of photos, shaking hands with the warden, nodding to the cluster of boys assembled in the courtyard. They had been lined up like props, some smiling nervously, some staring at the ground. Michael moved down the row, palm to palm, a practiced smile on his lips. But halfway along, something made him pause. Off to the side, against the crumbling wall, a boy sat cross-legged, head bent as he methodically whittled a small piece of wood with a blunt knife. No attempt to stand, no forced smile. He didn't even glance up until Michael's shadow fell across him. Then, slowly, the boy lifted his head, and their eyes met. For a brief, unsettling moment, Michael felt as if he were looking into a mirror distorted by time. The same sharp lines in the cheekbones, the same almond-shaped eyes, though the boy's gaze was unguarded in its hostility. The sound of a reporter clearing his throat broke the moment, and Michael moved on without comment, though his mind lingered. Inside the main hall, the warden began his rehearsed speech about the center's struggles and its potential. Michael listened with half an ear, his attention drifting back to the boy by the wall. There had been something in that gaze, not fear, not deference, but a challenge. It irritated him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Most people bent, even if subtly, in the presence of power. This boy hadn't shifted an inch. As he adjusted his cufflink, Michael told himself it was nothing. Just another troubled youth among many. Still, when he glanced toward the courtyard again, the boy was gone, leaving only the small curl of wood shavings on the ground. The speeches began as planned, Michael at the podium, cameras rolling, a carefully written address about opportunity and shared responsibility. He kept his voice firm but warm, his gestures broad enough for the photographers to capture. He was halfway through a line about lifting young men into a future they deserve when it happened. A voice, loud, clear, and edged with mocking humor, cut across the room. Funny how rich men only remember we exist when they need to feel better about themselves. The words hung in the air like smoke. The room stilled. Staff members froze, some looking horrified, others glancing toward the source. It was the boy from the courtyard, leaning against the wall now, arms folded. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, locked on Michael with the precision of a blade. Michael's security detail shifted slightly, ready to intervene, but Michael lifted a hand, keeping him back. He didn't smile, not for the cameras, not for anyone, but there was a flicker of something, an unspoken challenge accepted. "And what would you suggest instead?" Michael asked, his voice calm but edged. The boy shrugged, the movement slow and deliberate. "Maybe start by coming here when there aren't cameras." A few inmates chuckled under their breath. The warden looked ready to faint. Michael finished his speech without further incident, but the moment stuck with him like a burr under fine fabric. On the drive back to Victoria Island, Philip chattered about the coverage they'd get, but Michael barely listened. He could still hear the boy's voice, confident, unapologetic, and far older than his years. There was a story there, one he couldn't yet see but could feel, like a shadow on the edge of his vision. And though he would never have admitted it to himself, Michael found he was already thinking of reasons to come back. The idea came from Philip the following week, but Michael didn't need much convincing. The boy, Chike, the warden had said his name had the kind of raw presence you couldn't buy. He was defiant, unpolished, unpredictable, and somehow magnetic. Philip pitched it as a win-win. Chike could be positioned as the poster child for Michael's rehabilitation project. The media would eat up the narrative of a once troubled youth turning his life around under the guidance of a respected billionaire. The visual alone, the suited CEO and the reformed street boy, was worth millions in political goodwill. Michael didn't tell Philip the truth. That part of him wanted to see if he could break through that wall Chike carried in his eyes. At the detention center, Michael presented the offer directly to the boy, flanked by the warden and two of his aides. "You'll get early release under the mentorship program," Michael explained. "You work with us, attend public events, show you're turning things around. In return, you avoid transfer to an adult facility." Chike sat on his bunk, face unreadable, and let the silence stretch uncomfortably. Finally, he said, "So I smile for your cameras, and you use me to make yourself look good?" His voice was flat, but Michael thought he detected a sliver of bitterness beneath the sarcasm. "Call it an opportunity," Michael replied evenly. Chike didn't agree right away. He asked for time, which Michael respected, or perhaps, strategically, he knew would make the boy feel less cornered. When the warden later told Michael that Chike had agreed to participate, he felt a faint ripple of satisfaction. Not because he had won, but because the boy hadn't rejected the idea outright. The next week, Chike stood beside Michael in the prison courtyard for the first mentorship press event. The cameras clicked furiously as Michael rested a hand on the boy's shoulder and spoke about second chances. Chike didn't smile. He didn't even look at the lens. Instead, he stared just past the cameras, as if daring anyone to think this moment meant he was grateful. Philip was annoyed. He had wanted warmth, emotion, something that would make the public swoon. But Michael didn't mind. If anything, Chike's resistance made the story feel less manufactured. It was as though the boy refused to be bought, and that paradoxically made him even more compelling. Over the next several weeks, Chike was given structured work, tutoring sessions, and supervised community service as part of the program. Michael visited periodically, sometimes with the press, sometimes without. The tension between them was palpable during every interaction. Chike answered questions when necessary, but never offered more than what was asked. He moved through the program like someone serving time in a different kind of prison, the one where your jailer smiled for the cameras. Yet Michael noticed small things others missed. How Chike helped a younger inmate fix a broken sandal. How he quietly slid his food tray toward another boy who hadn't been served. These were not the gestures of someone rotten to the core. Michael filed the observations away without comment, not yet ready to admit they mattered to him more than they should. If Michael had expected Chike to be cooperative now that he was part of the program, he was wrong. At the second public event, a book donation ceremony, the boy arrived late, his shirt untucked, and offered only a curt nod when Michael greeted him. Philip's eyes flashed with irritation, but Michael kept his tone even, introducing Chike to the gathered reporters as though nothing were amiss. "This young man has been working hard," Michael said into the microphones. Chike's lips twitched into something that might have been a smirk. "Working, yeah," he muttered just loud enough for the microphones to pick up. The clip made it onto evening broadcasts, some anchors laughing about the boy's honest charm, others questioning if Michael's poster child was mocking him. The controversy only made the program more visible, and though Philip tried to spin it as planned authenticity, Michael knew it wasn't. That was pure Chike, saying what he felt, regardless of the fallout. Away from the cameras, the friction continued. In meetings, Chike challenged Michael's instructions, asking why they were doing certain activities and whether they truly helped anyone or just made good photos. Michael, who was used to unquestioned obedience from employees and associates, found himself explaining. And once he started explaining, he noticed his own arguments were weaker than he liked to admit. Chike's skepticism forced him to think about the program beyond the PR value, something he had not anticipated. But the boy's distrust wasn't baseless. He had been in and out of trouble since age 12, sometimes guilty, sometimes simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. His life had taught him that most people who came promising help left as soon as they had gotten what they wanted. To him, Michael was just another polished liar in a long line of them. And yet, in the rare, quiet moments, there were flashes of something else. One afternoon, Michael walked into the center unannounced and found Chike in the corner of the library, helping a smaller boy spell out words from an old paperback novel. His voice was patient, his tone gentle, his large hands turning the pages carefully so they wouldn't tear. When Chike noticed Michael watching, he closed the book abruptly and walked away without a word. Michael didn't call him back. But that image, the guarded boy with the soft edges he didn't want anyone to see, stayed with him long after he left. The first time Michael visited the center without the press, the staff seemed caught off guard. There were no banners, no staged handshakes, just the hum of daily routines. Michael told the warden he wanted to check in on the boys informally, to see the program in action without the performance. The warden, still clearly eager to impress, insisted on accompanying him, but Michael waved him off. He wanted to move freely, unfiltered. He found Chike in the carpentry workshop, smoothing the edge of a crude stool with sandpaper. The boy looked up briefly, then returned to his work without greeting. "You don't like cameras," Michael said, leaning against the doorway. "I don't like liars," Chike replied evenly. There was no heat in his voice, just fact, and Michael found himself respecting the bluntness. They spoke haltingly, Michael asking questions about the work, Chike answering in short sentences. It wasn't until Michael asked about his schooling that the boy's tone shifted. "Dropped out," Chike said flatly. "Had to work. My mother couldn't do it alone." Michael didn't press, sensing a wall go up. But something in that sentence, "my mother couldn't do it alone," stayed with him. He didn't know the details yet, but he felt the weight of those words. They spoke of absence, of someone who should have been there but wasn't. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built an empire that employed thousands. Yet here was a boy who seemed to think the world had left him entirely to fend for himself. That visit ended without any grand moment. No handshake or promise. But as Michael drove away, he realized he was thinking less about how Chike would look in campaign posters, and more about the kind of life that had shaped him into someone so quick to suspect the worst in people. He didn't recognize it yet, but a shift had begun. The boy was no longer just a piece in a political game. He was becoming a question Michael didn't have an answer for. And for a man who prided himself on always knowing the next move, that was unsettling. Michael arrived at the center earlier than usual that morning, hoping to catch Chike without the usual bustle of activities. The air was still cool, the sky pale with the promise of sunrise, and most of the boys were still milling around lazily after breakfast. He walked past the dusty basketball court and heard voices drifting from the library, not the loud chatter he expected, but a measured, deliberate cadence. Peering through the half-open door, he saw Chike sitting at one of the cracked wooden tables with two other boys, a battered dictionary open between them. Chike's large hands moved slowly over the page, tracing words as he explained their meanings, breaking down syllables, pausing when one of the boys stumbled. His tone was patient, his gaze attentive, a side of him Michael had never seen in their tense, clipped interactions. For nearly 20 minutes, Michael stood unnoticed, watching as Chike coaxed the boys into reading full sentences from an old novel, smiling faintly whenever they got it right. It wasn't the grin of someone performing for praise. It was quiet satisfaction, private and unannounced. When Chike finally noticed him in the doorway, the smile vanished, replaced by the familiar guarded expression. "What are you doing here this early?" Chike asked, closing the dictionary. "Checking on the program," Michael said evenly, stepping into the room. "Looks like you're running your own." Chike shrugged, as if embarrassed by the observation. "They asked me to help. I know what it's like to be laughed at for not knowing things. People think you're stupid when no one's ever taught you." The words hit harder than Michael expected. He thought of his own years in school, not private schools like his children attended now, but overcrowded public classrooms where he'd been one of the lucky ones to have an uncle who could afford his fees. He wondered what path his life would have taken if no one had stepped in for him. "You could teach more," Michael said after a moment. "Not for the cameras. For them." Chike met his gaze for a long moment, searching for sarcasm, then nodded once before gathering the books. On the drive back to his office later that day, Michael found his mind replaying the image of Chike leaning over the dictionary. It wasn't that he was impressed by the boy's intelligence. He had seen that in their earlier verbal sparring. It was the discipline, the patience, the choice to use his limited freedom to build something in someone else. That kind of choice couldn't be manufactured for PR, and it made Michael uneasy, because it reminded him that maybe his program was doing more for him than for the boy. For the first time, the thought of losing Chike to the streets again, of him slipping through the cracks once more, felt personal. The confrontation came unexpectedly, sparked by something small. They were in the carpentry workshop, sanding down a table that would be donated to a local school. Michael was asking casual questions, the kind meant to sound conversational, but also gather details for speeches, when he asked Chike what kind of work his father did. The boy's shoulders stiffened instantly, the sandpaper freezing mid-stroke. "Don't have one," he said, the words clipped. "Everyone has a father," Michael replied, not thinking. That was when Chike dropped the sandpaper and looked him dead in the eye. "Yeah, and men like you always leave." The air between them went cold, the smell of sawdust suddenly sharp in Michael's nostrils. There was no anger in Chike's tone, only the raw, matter-of-fact delivery of a wound too deep to hide. Michael felt the weight of the words in his chest, heavy and unfamiliar. For a moment, he wanted to press, to ask what had happened, but the boy had already turned away, busying himself with tools as if the conversation had ended. Michael stood there longer than he should have, his mind pulling threads he hadn't touched in years, a girl he had loved in university, the arguments with his family, the abrupt ending that had never been resolved. He shook himself free of the memory before it could settle, reminding himself this was about the program, not his past. Yet, the way Chike had spoken, as if fathers were interchangeable disappointments, gnawed at him. It was a pain that seemed too familiar for Michael to dismiss. Later that night, in his quiet Ikoyi home, Michael sat in his study long after his children had gone to bed. The shelves behind him were lined with awards, framed photographs, and leather-bound books that had never been opened. His mind kept returning to Chike's voice, to the way he had delivered that line without flinching. It wasn't just bitterness, it was truth as Chike knew it. And it stirred something dangerous in Michael. Curiosity mixed with guilt. He had entered this program to polish his image, but now he found himself wanting answers that had nothing to do with politics. By the third month of the program, Michael's visits had shifted. The cameras were still there sometimes, they had to be, for the campaign, but more often he came without warning, without press, and without speeches. He had begun speaking to the warden about Chike's release plan, pushing quietly for an early transition into the mentorship phase outside the center. The warden had reservations, citing the boy's history of attitude problems and prior offenses, but Michael countered with the tangible changes he had seen: improved workshop performance, no recent fights, and voluntary tutoring of other inmates. "You've got half the boys here because nobody believed in them," Michael said, leaning across the desk. "Don't make him one of the ones who never got out." The warden hesitated, but agreed to submit a recommendation for review. When Chike heard the news, his reaction was not the gratitude Michael might have expected. "So I'm getting out because you pulled strings," the boy said flatly. "Not because I earned it." Michael's first instinct was to argue, to list the ways Chike had earned it, but he caught himself. "Maybe both can be true," he replied. Chike gave a short, humorless laugh. "Or maybe I'm just your investment. Can't have your star project rotting in here too long, right?" The words stung more than Michael cared to admit. He wanted to tell the boy he was wrong, that this was no longer just about optics, but he knew it would sound like another rich man's promise. That evening, back in his car, Michael watched the streets blur past. Hawkers weaving between traffic, Okadas darting through impossible gaps, children chasing a punctured football in a narrow alley. For the first time in years, he felt the sharp awareness that money couldn't buy certain things: trust, forgiveness, the ability to rewrite the past. He had entered this mentorship to create a symbol for his campaign. Now, he found himself wanting to protect Chike for reasons that had nothing to do with votes. And though he didn't yet know it, the path he was on would take him much further into the boy's life than he had ever planned. The day began with yet another community service project for the cameras, though this one was smaller: repainting the walls of a dilapidated primary school in Mushin. Michael had agreed to attend only because Philip insisted they needed colorful, grassroots-friendly coverage before the next phase of the campaign. The sun was merciless, beating down on the small group of volunteers and inmates turned apprentices, Chike among them, rolling a brush across the wall with exaggerated slowness. At first, Michael supervised from the shade, issuing instructions and posing for the occasional shot. But after one particularly insistent journalist urged him to get his hands dirty, he picked up a brush and joined in. It was supposed to be symbolic, but after the first streak of paint, he found himself oddly focused on the task. The rhythmic motion of the brush against rough plaster was unexpectedly grounding. At some point, Michael moved too quickly and splattered a streak of pale blue across the back of Chike's shirt. The boy stopped mid-stroke, turned with deliberate slowness, and dipped his own brush into the paint before flicking it toward Michael's trouser leg. The stain landed like a flag of rebellion. For a beat, no one moved. The volunteers looked stunned. Philip looked like he might have a stroke. And then, to everyone's shock, Michael laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a deep, unguarded laugh that startled even him. "You'll regret that," he said, but there was no threat in his voice. Chike smirked and went back to painting, and something in the tension between them shifted. Later, during the water break, Chike muttered, "Guess you're not made of glass after all." It was the closest thing to a compliment Michael had heard from him. That evening, as Michael reviewed the day's photographs, he noticed that in the candid shots, the ones taken after the paint incident, both he and Chike looked less like politician and project, more like two people sharing the same space without walls between them. The realization unsettled him. He had been building this connection slowly, almost unintentionally, and for the first time, it wasn't about optics. That laugh had been real, uncalculated, and it had come from something as simple as a paint stain. It was a reminder that not every valuable moment came from strategy, and not every connection needed a script. 2 weeks later, Philip came into Michael's office with a gleam in his eye and a folder in his hand. "Time to close the loop on your rehabilitation project," he announced. Inside the folder were logistics for a final PR highlight before Chike's release, a home visit to meet his mother, film a heartfelt reunion, and position Michael as a man who doesn't just fund change, but follows it into the personal lives of those he helps. "We'll get shots of you at their table, maybe handing over a small scholarship check. It's gold for the campaign," Philip said. Michael skimmed the notes. The plan was airtight: arrival with a small crew, a brief interview with the mother, then a joint statement about Chike's progress. He agreed without hesitation. On paper, it was perfect. On the day of the visit, the convoy wound its way out of the island's polished streets into the dense, narrow lanes of Ajagunal. The contrast was stark. Here, the buildings leaned tiredly into each other, the gutters overflowed, and children played barefoot in the dust. As Michael stepped out of the SUV, curious faces peeked from doorways. A production assistant scurried ahead to confirm the address, and Michael followed, his shoes collecting fine red dust. At the designated house, the paint was faded, the corrugated roof patched in places, but a neat broom rested against the wall. He adjusted his suit, preparing the smile he reserved for moments of public warmth. The camera crew took their positions. The door opened slowly, and the first thing Michael saw was a pair of eyes, wide, wary, and unforgettable. His breath caught before the rest of her came into view. Adiz. The name slammed into his mind like an echo from decades past. She looked older, of course, the softness of youth replaced by the fine lines of endurance, her hair tied back in a simple scarf. But it was her. His first love from university, the one his family had made him leave. Behind her, the camera crew murmured, oblivious to the storm gathering in the doorway. Michael's throat tightened. "Adiz," he said, barely above a whisper. Her face hardened instantly, and whatever warmth the crew had expected from this meeting vanished. For a long, heavy moment, neither of them moved. The crew glanced between them, sensing that something unscripted was unfolding, but unsure of what it meant. Adiz stepped aside without a word, and Michael entered the small living room. The space was modest but spotless: a faded sofa, a neatly arranged shelf of well-worn books, the faint scent of stew simmering from the kitchen. Chike stood near the window, confusion written across his face as he looked between them. "You two know each other?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Adiz's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is Michael Okafor," she said, not as an introduction, but as an indictment. Michael turned toward Chike, the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. He could see it now, in the set of the boy's jaw, the shape of his eyes. The resemblance was no longer something he could explain away as coincidence. He opened his mouth to speak, but Adiz's voice cut through. "Tell him, Michael. Tell him why you're really here." Her words were sharp enough to slice through the carefully constructed PR narrative. Chike's brow furrowed, his fists curling slightly at his sides. "What's going on?" he demanded. Michael glanced at the cameras, then back at Adiz. "Not here," he said quietly. But Adiz's gaze didn't soften. "You left me," she said, her voice low but steady. "You left us. And now you're standing here like it's charity." The words hit harder than Michael was prepared for, each one a reminder of choices he had buried under ambition and obedience to his family's will. He tried to speak, to explain, but Chike's voice broke in cold, flat, and laced with betrayal. "So you knew? All this time you knew?" Michael shook his head, but it felt hollow even to him. In that moment, the room seemed to shrink, the cameras felt intrusive, and the air was thick with years of anger and abandonment. Michael realized with a sinking heart that whatever fragile trust he'd been building with Chike had just shattered, and the pieces were sharper than he had imagined. The silence after Chike's question was like a physical weight pressing against Michael's chest. The camera crew, sensing the tension, had shifted from heartwarming reunion to something they couldn't package for the evening news. began exchanging uneasy glances. One of Philip's assistants discreetly gestured for them to step outside, but neither Michael nor Adiz noticed. Chike's eyes bored into Michael's, demanding an answer, but it wasn't just curiosity. It was an accusation. "You knew all along," he said again, voice harder this time. Michael shook his head, forcing himself to meet the boy's gaze. "No, I didn't know, Chike. I swear to you I didn't." But the words, though true, sounded like something any man caught in a lie would say. Years of disappointment had taught Chike not to believe quickly. Adiz crossed her arms, her stance unyielding. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," she said. "You walked away when your mother told you I wasn't good enough. You didn't fight for me. And you never came back to see if the truth was different from what they fed you." Michael's breath caught. He wanted to tell her that he had been young, that he had felt powerless against the weight of his family's expectations, but looking at her now, he realized how pitiful that would sound. Chike turned toward his mother. "So he's my father?" The words were a statement, not a question. Adiz nodded once, her eyes never leaving Michael's. Chike's jaw tightened. "Then you've been standing here pretending to care about me for the cameras, when the truth is, you're the reason I grew up without a father." The bitterness in the boy's voice struck Michael like a blow. He stepped forward, lowering his voice so it wouldn't tremble. "Chike, I didn't come here knowing you were mine. I came here for a program. Yes, but I stayed because I saw something in you, before I knew the truth. That hasn't changed." But Chike's expression was closed, the shutters drawn tight. "It changes everything," he said, brushing past Michael toward the door. "You can keep your program. I don't want anything from you." The door slammed behind him, leaving Michael and Adiz in the dim, suffocating room, both of them weighed down by the years they could never get back. The story leaked within 48 hours, though Michael couldn't prove which set of hands had passed it to the press. The headlines were vicious. Governor Hopeful linked to juvenile offender son. Hidden family? Okafor's secret past exposed. News segments replayed footage from the earlier parts of the program, freezing on Michael's hand on Chike's shoulder, pairing it with gossip about abandoned lovers and illegitimate children. Philip stormed into Michael's office with the fury of a man watching months of careful planning unravel. "You've turned a clean narrative into a scandal," he snapped, pacing the length of the room. "You think voters care about your sob story? They'll see a man who plays savior in public and leaves his own blood to rot." Michael sat at his desk, hands steepled, listening but not reacting. His mind wasn't on the campaign anymore. It was on Chike, on the way the boy had looked at him before walking out. He had tried calling Adiz twice since then, but she hadn't picked up. He couldn't blame her. For years she had built a life without him, and his sudden reappearance had done more harm than good. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that walking away now would be the same mistake he'd made all those years ago. "I'm going to fix this," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. Philip stopped pacing. "By fix, you mean cutting ties. Now, before more damage is done." Michael looked up sharply. "By fix, I mean making sure Chike knows I'm not going anywhere this time, even if it costs me the election." Philip stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You think sacrificing your career for a boy who doesn't want your help will make this better? You think the press will applaud you for that?" Michael didn't answer right away. He was thinking about the paint splatter on his trousers, the way Chike had laughed for the first time that day in Mushin. That laugh had been real, and Michael realized that maybe, just maybe, it mattered more than 1,000 staged smiles from voters. He turned his chair toward the window. "If the choice is between a seat in the governor's mansion and my son," he said, "then the choice isn't difficult." If Philip's warnings had been sharp, his family's reaction was sharper still. That Sunday, Michael attended the usual lunch at his mother's house in Akoi, a sprawling, white-pillared home that smelled faintly of polish and tradition. His mother, elegant in a gold lace blouse and wrapper, waited until the staff had cleared the table before speaking. "I've read the papers," she said, her voice cool. "I've heard the talk. Tell me it isn't true." Michael didn't flinch. "It's true." The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air. His younger sister shifted uncomfortably, but his mother's expression hardened into something immovable. Do you understand what this does to our name? To your campaign? To everything we built? What you built, Michael corrected gently. And yes, I understand. But I won't deny him. His mother's nostrils flared. That boy is trouble, Michael. Look at his record. He's been in and out of trouble since he was 12. You think voters will separate his crimes from your judgment? They won't. They'll see weakness. And weakness loses elections. Michael's jaw tightened. What they see doesn't matter to me right now. He's my son. His mother's voice sharpened. A son you didn't know existed until 5 minutes ago. Don't throw away your future for a boy who's already half ruined himself. The words landed with the cold precision only a parent's disapproval could deliver, but Michael stood his ground. If you want me to abandon him the way I abandoned his mother, I won't do it, he said. His mother's eyes narrowed. Then understand this. If you keep this up, I will publicly denounce her. I will tell the press exactly what kind of woman she was and is. Michael felt the familiar burn of anger rise in his chest, but he swallowed it. If you do that, you'll be lying, he said quietly. And you'll prove to him everything he already believes about people like us. He pushed his chair back, the scrape against the marble floor echoing in the vast room. I'm not walking away this time, he added before leaving, knowing full well that every step he took away from that table was also a step away from the world he had been raised to protect. The first time Michael visited Adi's home after the confrontation, he didn't bring a convoy or a camera crew. He came alone, in a modest black sedan, dressed not in his usual crisp suit, but in a plain shirt and trousers. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows on the narrow streets of Ajagunal. He parked a short distance away and walked, ignoring the curious stares of passers-by who recognized him from the news. When he knocked, the door opened just a fraction. Adi's guarded eyes appeared through the crack. We have nothing to say to each other, she began, but he spoke before she could close it. I'm not here to explain away the past, he said. I'm here to say I'm sorry, and to tell you I'm not leaving again. The door remained half open for a long moment before she stepped back, allowing him inside. The living room felt smaller than before, more claustrophobic now that the air was charged with unspoken history. Chaik was seated at the table, sketching something on a scrap of paper. His hand stilled when he saw Michael. I thought I made it clear I didn't want anything from you, the boy said, his tone sharper than the pencil he held. Michael nodded. You did. But I'm not here because you want me. I'm here because I need to be. Chaik scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Need? You don't need anything. You have everything. Michael stepped closer, his voice low but firm. Everything but you. The words seemed to hang in the space between them, and for a moment, Chaik's eyes flickered with something that wasn't outright hostility, but it vanished quickly. You can't just show up and expect me to believe you, he said. Then don't believe me, Michael replied. Watch me. Over the next few weeks, Michael kept his word. He visited without warning, sometimes bringing small things, a bag of groceries, textbooks, tools for the workshop, but never in a way that felt like payment. He helped repair a broken kitchen shelf one afternoon, quietly passing nails to Chaik while Adiz stirred stew on the stove. He didn't press for conversations, didn't demand gratitude. It was a strange new rhythm, a man used to commanding boardrooms, now learning to wait in silence for trust that might never come. Yet each time he left, Michael felt a little less like an intruder, and a little more like someone reclaiming a place he should have never lost. It happened on a day Michael hadn't planned to visit. A call from the warden had informed him that one of Chaik's friends from the center, a wiry boy named Sei, had been denied a job at a mechanic shop because of his record. Without thinking twice, Michael drove across town to speak with the shop owner himself. He didn't mention his title or political ambitions. Instead, he vouched for Sei as a personal favor. The owner hesitated, then agreed to take the boy on probation. When Michael relayed the news to Sei later that afternoon, the boy's grin was wide enough to split the sky. You didn't have to do that, Sei said. Michael smiled faintly. Sometimes you do things not because you have to, but because it's right. That evening, Michael stopped by Adi's home to drop off some workshop materials. Chike was there, leaning against the doorway with folded arms. "Say he told me what you did," he said. Michael shrugged. He deserved a chance. Chike studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You could have just called someone and had it done. But you went yourself." Michael met his gaze steadily. "Some things are worth doing in person." There was a long pause, then Chike's shoulders loosened slightly. "He's a good guy. He's been through a lot." Michael nodded. "So have you." For the first time, Chike didn't flinch at the acknowledgement. He simply turned and walked back inside, but there was no bitterness in his step. In the weeks that followed, the air between them shifted almost imperceptibly. Chike began asking Michael the occasional question about his business or the mechanics of running a project. They even shared a few short laughs, the kind that didn't feel forced. Adiz noticed the change but said nothing, watching silently as a fragile bridge began to form. Michael understood that this wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was something rarer. It was permission to try again. And in that permission, he felt a responsibility heavier than any corporate deal he'd ever signed. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a phone call from Philip, his voice tight with urgency. "We have a problem," he said. "One of your opponent's teams has dug into Chike's juvenile record. They're planning to leak details about his arrests, the fights, the theft charge, everything. They'll spin it to say you've been mentoring a criminal to hide your own failings as a father." Michael leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Let them," he said after a beat. There was a stunned silence on the other end. "Michael, do you understand what this will do to your campaign? This isn't a charity photo op anymore. This is a political liability." Michael's reply was steady. "Then I guess I'll have to live with that." The leak came 2 days later. Headlines blared with Chike's past offenses, each one framed as evidence of Michael's poor judgment. Talk shows debated whether he could still be trusted to lead. Opposition figures called for him to cut ties with the boy before the rot spread further. Through it all, Michael refused to make a single public statement against Chike. Instead, he doubled down on his visits, appearing in Adjugal more frequently than before. The cameras tried to follow, but he sent them away. If the public wanted to see weakness in his loyalty, they'd have to look elsewhere. One evening, as he was leaving Adiz's home, she stopped him at the door. "You're risking everything for him," she said, her voice caught between disbelief and gratitude. Michael met her eyes. "I already lost him once without even knowing it. I'm not going to lose him again just to keep a title." Behind her, Chike stood silently in the shadows, listening. He didn't speak, but his expression, softer, almost uncertain, told Michael that his silence was no longer rejection. It was consideration, and that, for now, was enough. The meeting had been framed as strategic alignment, which was how powerful men said, "This is where you choose who you are." They gathered in a private room at a Victoria Island hotel, where the carpet swallowed footsteps, and the walls looked thick enough to keep secrets from finding air. A party financier with a politician smile began by listing the week's damage. Polling dips among middle-class voters. Headlines pairing Michael's name with the word illegitimate. Whispered doubts about his judgment. Then came the solutions, offered in the steady cadence of people who are used to being obeyed. First, a drafted statement clarifying that Chike was not his son, and that any insinuation otherwise was malicious slander. Second, a charitable endowment to children's welfare large enough to drown out other noise. Third, a private payment, disguised as legal aid, to ensure the boy disappeared to a vocational program in a different state, far from cameras and questions. A governor from a neighboring state, half smiling over a glass of water, added the unvarnished truth. "Take the deal, Michael. You're almost there. Don't set fire to the house because a boy knocked at the door." Michael let the words settle. He looked at the press release, at the softened lies arranged like cushions, and thought of the times he had traded truth for utility. He could not count them, but he felt the total in his bones. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that everyone leaned in. "No statements that erase him," he said. "No payments to bury him. If that costs me the race, then I lose." A donor chuckled in disbelief. "You'll throw away a governorship for a boy with a record?" Michael's hands lay still on the table. I'll throw away a governorship to be the man I keep pretending to be. Chairs scraped. The financier warned that politics rewarded discipline, not sentiment. Michael stood. Then let politics do what it does. I'll do what a father should. The room cooled by a few degrees. Someone muttered that he was finished. If so, he thought, better finished than false. Chike had come to the hotel with Sei to drop off a folder of apprenticeship placements Michael's office had arranged. The secretary told them to wait in a small service corridor beside the conference room. The building's air conditioning hummed, and voices carried him perfectly through the door, snatches of phrases, the press of consonants, a word here and there that cut clean. Disown, statement, remove him. Chike didn't move, eyes fixed on the silver of light at the base of the door, as if it could translate motives. He told himself not to care. He told himself men, like Michael, always chose comfort when the bill came due. Then he heard Michael's voice, calm and steady, say the words that didn't fit the script Chike had written for rich men. No, I won't hide him. Another voice suggested relocating the boy. Michael, his name is Chike. The reply arrived like something heavy breaking. He's finished. Michael again, maybe, but not by me. Chike felt the shock hit low in his stomach, a sensation close to falling and closer to being caught. He remembered night at 13 when a neighbor's father had come to the police station, signed papers without looking at him, and left before Chike could thank him. The man's kindness had lasted exactly as long as it took the cameras to flash. He had learned then that rescue often came with an invoice he couldn't pay. In the corridor, Sei whispered, "We should go." Chike shook his head, listening until the room fell quiet and footsteps faded. He didn't wait for Michael to find him. He left the folder with the receptionist and walked out into the heat, feeling the city press its ordinary life against him while something unfamiliar arranged itself under his ribs. He still didn't trust the man, but doubt had developed edges in the opposite direction. Now, what if trust, the smallest piece of it, didn't break him? Michael found him that evening in Ajagunal, perched on the low wall outside the house, turning a thin strip of wood between his fingers the way he did when his thoughts wouldn't settle. They regarded each other without ceremony. "I heard you," Chike said finally. "At the hotel." Michael exhaled. "Then you know where I stand." Chike nodded once, a gesture that admitted less than acceptance, but more than refusal. "You could have saved yourself," he said. "It would have been easy." Michael's mouth tilted, tired, not triumphant. "It's been easy for a long time. Easy got me here. Easy also kept me from you." They sat with that. Traffic breathed its patterns at the end of the street. A neighbor's radio threaded high life through the dusk. "I can't promise I won't get angry again," Chike said at last, the confession plain. "I don't know how to do this, but I'm listening." Michael swallowed, the sound loud in his own ears. "I don't want your anger to vanish," he said. "I want it to have somewhere safe to go." Chike looked down at the wood, then held it out. It was a small carving, rough, unfinished, of two figures standing shoulder to shoulder, the space between them not quite closed. "It's nothing," he muttered. Michael took it like it was not nothing. "Tomorrow," he said, "there's a hearing to finalize your transition out of the center. I'll be there. Not as a sponsor. As your," the word caught. He allowed it through. "As your father." Chike's jaw worked, then eased. "Then come," he said. "And keep coming." They didn't hug. They didn't shake hands. They just sat until the streetlights came on, two silhouettes with a small piece of wood between them, the space narrowing. The speech was scheduled for noon in a modest hall downtown, the kind where plastic chairs keep audiences honest, and microphones sometimes crackle before they carry truth. Michael arrived without the usual parade, no branded backdrops, no queue of party men ready to nod on cue. Cameras clustered anyway, fed by the rumor that a candidate was about to step off a moving train. He took the podium, adjusted nothing, and began. He didn't reach for storybook origins or scriptwriter's lines. He said his name, the offices he had held, the mistakes he had made that money hid more neatly than it healed. He said the words, "I left someone," without assigning blame to mothers or youth or time. He refused to sanitize his reasons and refused to outsource his responsibility. He said Chike's name once and only once, not to hold it up but to keep it from being twisted. And he asked the press to aim their lights elsewhere when they looked for villains. Then he stepped into the part everyone had gathered for. "I am suspending my campaign for governor," he said, the sentence even and whole. "Public service is not a costume I wear. If I claim to care for this state, but cannot be present for one boy who bears my name, then every promise I make is hollow. I will not ask you to choose between believing my policies and believing my apology. I will choose for you." The room muttered. A reporter shouted whether this was an admission of weakness. Michael answered without flinching. "It's an admission of scale." He thanked those who had stood with him and those who had opposed him, then stepped away as microphones stretched like hands trying to pull him back into a story he had ended. Outside, the air felt newly ordinary. He breathed it like medicine. His mother called that evening to tell him he had embarrassed the family. He listened, said he loved her, and did not argue. Some doors you close gently and leave as they are. They didn't hold a ribbon cutting for the center. They opened the doors and let work make its own noise. The building was a repurposed warehouse off the expressway, patched and painted by volunteers whose names would never trend. Inside, sunlight fell through high windows onto rows of workbenches, a corner library with donated shelves, a small office where paperwork could be done without becoming the whole day. They called it the West Bridge Workshop because it sat west of the bridges most opportunities live on, and because the point wasn't a destination but a crossing. Michael wrote the first check and the second, then learned which ones to stop writing so the place would not become a monument to his signature. Chike argued for the carpentry program to expand slowly, tools first, then trainers, then intake, because rushing had been the ruin of every plan anyone had dropped on his head. Say he arrived before dawn on the first week to pitch in, his hands already carrying the pride of being seen as useful. A D supervised the library after work, pressing novels and manuals into hands with the quiet zeal of someone who knows exactly what pages can do when the world keeps asking for proof you deserve your life. On a humid Friday, a boy who had learned his letters in the detention center read aloud to a room of others and tripped only twice. The applause surprised him and then rebuilt him a little. Michael watched from the edge, leaning against a pillar, keeping still so the place would never start orbiting him again. When a reporter wandered in asking for a human angle, Chike pointed him to the schedule board, where names were written in chalk. "Pick any," he said. "They're all human. Angles optional." The story ran the next day with a photo of hands sanding wood. It was the right scale. Late one evening, after the tools were locked and the last radio show had signed off, father and son sat on the stoop outside the warehouse, watching trucks drift past like tired whales. The day's heat had loosened. The air tasted of sawdust and fried plantain from a stall that refused to close on time. They didn't talk first about big things. They talked about whether to add a metalwork section or fix the leak above bench 3, about the kid who kept showing up early because home was loud, about the way a plane on final approach looks like it's hanging by string. Eventually, the conversation found the place it had been heading. "When you left back then," Chike said, voice low, "did you think about us?" Michael didn't reach for a better past. "I thought about me," he said. "I told myself it was duty. It was fear. It was everything except a choice that belonged to me. And it was wrong." The admission wasn't a performance. It sat there, small and heavy, the way truth does when it's in its correct size. Chike nodded, not as absolution, but as receipt. "I don't know how to be a son to you," he said. "I only know how to be me." Michael turned the unfinished carving in his pocket, the two figures with the gap not yet closed, and felt a smile arrive without announcement. "Good," he said. "Be you here. I'll learn the rest." They stood, stretching the ache from their backs, and walked the length of the street toward the bus stop where a D's waited with a thermos and a look that could quiet a room. They didn't notice the camera phone raised from across the road, and if the picture later made its way online, 3 dark shapes crossing under a blinking streetlight, the gap between them almost gone. It didn't change anything the next morning when the doors opened, the benches filled, and a new boy wrote his name on the board big enough to read it himself. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.